This is the land of the Southwest Indians of the United States. Made up of a part of New Mexico, Arizona, and small areas of Colorado and Utah, it is an arid land of sandstone buttes and valleys covered with yellow rabbit bush and mesquite. Except for the Navajos, the Indians live in pueblos, or villages, making their living as farmers, planting mainly corn and raising small herds of sheep and cattle. For hundreds of years, the Pueblo women have made their own baskets and pottery. Some of the men excel in making silver jewelry. The Hopis built their pueblos up on high cliffs where they would be fairly safe from enemy raiders. In the village of Shongopovi, on the second mesa in Arizona, live some of the Hopis' best basket makers. For their raw materials, they pick the tender inner leaves of the yucca bush, which grows in the desert a few miles from the pueblo. Mrs. Esther Honani has just returned from a trip to the desert. Slung over her back, she carries the load of yucca leaves, some of which she will bleach white in the sun, while others will be dyed brown or red. She already has a supply of yellow yucca leaves, which she picked last winter when the yucca is a natural yellow. The dyed shoots must be soft to work with, and to prepare them for use, they are laid on moist sand, and another layer of sand is sprinkled on top of them. They are covered and left for several hours until they are flexible. Now the job of basket weaving really begins. Mrs. Honani and her married daughter Adeline are working together. They must make 45 baskets for the family of Adeline's husband in exchange for the wedding garments they gave her. This is the way a basket is started. A bunch of split yucca leaves is held in one hand, and moistened straw is wound tightly around it, and then bent and tied into the beginning of a coil. Adeline's mother is continuing work on a deep coil basket, which she began several weeks ago. Adeline has now completed the center part of the coil. A steel awl is the only tool used. In earlier days, an awl made of bone was used. Mrs. Dungura, a neighbor, has dropped by for a chat and admires one of the finished baskets. Watch how Mrs. Honani splits the yucca leaves before she uses them. Her daughter fills her mouth with water and wets the coil to keep it pliable. Of course, basket weaving is a slow, tedious job. It takes several days to make one, not a few minutes, as shown on the screen. The basket is completed. Notice the white line that breaks the pattern from the center to the edge. This is the spirit line, which the Indians believe will allow the evil spirits at the center of the coil to escape. The spirit line is found on the oldest baskets still in existence. Adeline is proud of a basket she modeled after a Kachina doll, which represents an Indian goddess of rain and fertility. The pueblo of Zuni, 40 miles south of Gallup, New Mexico, was first seen by white men in 1537. This adobe church, in ruins now, was built by the Spaniards nearly 300 years ago. The stone house to the right of the church belongs to the present chief or governor. Next to it lives 90-year-old Isawasi Alapawa, who is the Zuni's oldest pottery maker. There is always a crowd of youngsters about when she works in her tiny yard. On top of a high butte southeast of Zuni, called the Corn or Ancient Mountain, the Zuni people hid their crops and took refuge when the Spaniards drove them out of their pueblo hundreds of years ago. Near the foot of this mountain, in a gully by a river, is a deposit of gray clay. Mrs. Alapawa has come here for many years to dig up just enough clay for a week's supply. This she will take home and dampen overnight by wrapping it in a wet cloth. The next morning, Mrs. Alapawa adds a piece of finely ground old pottery as temper to the fresh clay. This will prevent shrinkage or cracks when the pot is fired. The beginning of a new pot is a lump of clay rolled into a ball. Pushing her finger into the clay, she gradually works it into the shape of a bowl. The bowl is built up by adding coils or fillets of clay. The form is smoothed over with a stream-worn agate pebble. These stones are handed down from one generation to the next, and the more they are used, the smoother they get. After the shape is completed, newly made pottery is put inside the house for slow drying and scraped to the right thickness with a pottery scraper. For paint, a piece of manganese oxide is rubbed with water in a mortar of volcanic stone. Dried turkey weed, added to the paint, makes it stick to the bowl. A chewed up end of the midrib of a yucca leaf is used for a paintbrush. Mrs. Alapawa's hands are steady in spite of her years, as she paints the traditional religious designs, some of which are found on pots over 1,000 years old. Several pieces are painted before Mrs. Alapawa bakes them. At the left is a pottery owl, which is one of the sacred birds of the Zunis. After drying for several days, the pot is ready to be fired. This is done simply by baking it in an open-air fireplace in the yard. Dry manure is piled around the pot, and the whole covered with a metal lid. The manure is set afire and burns slowly for several hours. After it has burned out, the finished pot is removed. The pottery maker looks it over to see whether there are any cracks or imperfections. Mrs. Alapawa doesn't have far to go to sell the pottery she has made. The trader just down the street rates her work among the best in the Pueblo of Zuni. Across the plaza from the governor's house, next to the church ruins and the adjoining kiva, where the Zunis hold their sacred religious rituals, lives Harold Toussaint, jewelry maker. The Zunis specialize in silver inlay work. Harold's wife polishes stones while he hammers the silver. They get all their raw materials from the trader: turquoise mined in Nevada and Arizona, silver sheets of various thickness, silver wire for decoration, shells of different shapes and colors, from light amber to dark brown. And jet, imported from Italy. To make a bracelet, Mr. Toussaint has cut off a piece of sheet silver and split it into 3 connected bands. The designs are put on with the dies supplied by the trader. They are checked. Mrs. Toussaint is finishing inlay work on a knife wing, symbol for another Zuni god. Because they live in a village where they have electricity, they use motors for polishing. The polished stone is cemented into the silver form. Indian women like much jewelry and wear their best pieces themselves when they go to the Indian fairs. At the exhibit halls, they can look at fine, softly colored blankets made by the Navajos and sold by Indian girls. They too bear the traditional religious designs that are found on all Indian handiwork. These vividly colored rugs are made especially for the white man because they are more to his tastes than the softly colored ones. Ancient Zuni pottery is also displayed, sacred ceremonial vessels showing designs of the plumed serpent, who is the guardian of the sacred spring, and the deer, from whose line comes long life. Then there are heavy concho belts made by the Navajo craftsmen from hammered or cast silver. Jeweled wrist guards set with many stones, and rings with sacred symbols made by Zunis many years ago. Figures of silver inlay work, and antique solid turquoise statues that are prized possessions of families, traders, and collectors. For hundreds of years, the Pueblo women have made their own baskets and pottery. Some of the men excel in making silver jewelry. The Hopis built their pueblos up on high cliffs where they would be fairly safe from enemy raiders. In the village of Shongopovi, on the second mesa in Arizona, a load of yucca leaves, some of which she will bleach white in the sun, while others will be dyed brown or red. She already has a supply of yellow yucca leaves, which she picked last winter when the yucca is a natural yellow. This is the land of the Southwest Indians of the United States. Made up of a part of New Mexico, Arizona, and small areas of Colorado and Utah, it is an arid land of sandstone buttes and valleys covered with yellow rabbit bush and mesquite. Except for the Navajos, the Indians live in pueblos, or villages, making their living as farmers, planting mainly corn and raising small herds of sheep and cattle. Live some of the Hopi's best basket makers. For their raw materials, they pick the tender inner leaves of the yucca bush, which grows in the desert a few miles from the pueblo. Mrs. Esther Honani has just returned from a trip to the desert. Slung over her back, she carries the